What it do, bruh? Talk of the town, Nintendo, Doc Trey, still holding it down, still make the best games, and you know this, bro. It's the truth. If you don't like it, you can have that seatbelt. So, Metal Gear Solid Master Collection has a major issue on Nintendo Switch. And it actually has an issue on all the systems, to be honest. But the Nintendo Switch version in particular is very confusing and alarming. So if you guys haven't heard yet, Konami sent Nintendo Switch versions of this game out to the press for them to play. And the frame rate and also seemingly the resolution was not really up to snuff, and people were questioning what was going on with that and also what was going on with the other versions of the games. And Konami reached out and clarified the target resolution and frame rates for each system. And on the PlayStation 4, 5, Xbox Series S and X, it targets 1080p 60 frames per second. On the Switch in dock mode, it targets 1080p and 30 frames per second, and in handheld mode, 720p and 30 frames per second. Now, the issue with this is that these games are extremely old, and there is no reason why these games should be targeting these display resolutions or frame rates. So, first of all, the Nintendo Switch version is targeting, in dock mode at least, is targeting the native resolution of the Switch, which would be 1080p. That's fine. But the games will be 30 frames per second. And that's a big issue because Metal Gear Solid 2 on the PlayStation 2 was already 60 frames per second. And both Metal Gear Solid 2 and Metal Gear Solid 3 were released in an HD collection for the Xbox 360 10 years ago. And those games both ran at 60 frames per second. On the PlayStation 5, PlayStation 4, and Xbox Series X, the game is targeting 1080p 60 frames per second. These are PlayStation 2 games. And these are on systems that are able to do 4K native 120 frames per second on new games. And for some reason, Konami can't get these games to target the full resolution and frame rate of these systems, even though these games are from the PlayStation 2. And while it's a big issue on all of the systems, I think the bigger issue here is the Switch version running at 30 frames per second. Because while the PlayStation and Xbox versions are only 1080p on systems that can do 4K, the games will still be displayed at 4K on your 4K TV, and also your 4K TV will technically upscale it to 4K just like it would a 1080p Blu-ray. So it's not as big, so it's not going to be as crisp as it should be, but it's not the end of the world. At least they get 1080p upscaled to 4K with 60 frames per second. But on the Switch, 30 frames per second on PS2 games that were 60 frames per second originally. Like, how is that possible? How is that possible? And the only thing that I can think of is maybe instead of porting these games, they decided to just straight out emulate the Metal Gear Solid HD collection. Because as you know, when you try to emulate a game on an older system instead of porting it, it requires the system emulating the other system to be exponentially more powerful than what it's emulating, or there is going to be a lot of bugs and it's not going to run very well. So like that's the only logical conclusion I can come to. That is like, are they, instead of porting the game, are they just straight using like a Xbox 360 emulator or something? Like that's the only thing that kind of makes sense to me. And even if that was the case, why would they do that? It makes absolutely no sense. And this being 30 frames per second on the Switch, it honestly is kind of making me not want, like, it's making me not even want to buy the Switch version, because that's ridiculous. Like, imagine if they announced a Soul Calibur 2 remaster for the Switch and it was 30 frames per second. Like, that's pretty much what they're doing here. Like, that's insane. That's crazy. And I don't know, like, Konami, like, that, come on, like, come on. How is this even possible? Like, these games should run better than that, like, without them really even doing anything. Like, these systems are way more powerful than the PlayStation 2. How is this possible? How? Unacceptable.